I think we can officially start. I know that we will have some more people joining us later on, but I want to welcome all of you. Thank you so much for tuning in. And Anton, thank you for rising early to be with us. You're on the West
You know
Coast.
what my favorite Pokemon is? It's Snorlax, okay? And you woke me up way too early, so
So thank you so much
Where'd
for.
you just get that mug?
Yeah, where did you
it's
get them?
amazing. It's amazing. It's a Snorlax is my favorite Pokemon. And if you know Pokemon lore, it's the Snorlax whose superpower is sleeping. So
David is going
Whoa.
to be shopping on Amazon immediately after we're finished here.
But no, did you get that in Japan or something?
yes, no. I don't know where I got it from, but it's a crazy
Somebody
one.
has gifted to you, probably.
Yes.
All right. Well, thanks for. I will ask all of you to mute so that we minimize the background noise, just to make sure. And we will wait. Do I have everybody? Okay. Yes. All right, Anton. Thanks for being with us. I've known you since Juilliard years, so I'm excited that you have tuned in this morning and to share some.
Those were the days, my friends. It's a Russian song, by the way.
It is? I didn't know that.
Those were the дорогой длинною, да ночкой лунною, да с песней то. Of course, it's a Russian song. It's one of those things that Western culture stole from us, of course.
Well, that's another lecture. We will do one of those lectures where
We
you'll
definitely have to do that. Yes.
you'll show us all the Russian songs which were used on Broadway and in the West.
Oh, yes. Da, 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 da.
Oh my God. Anton, tell us a little bit about you before you start talking about Russian songs. I want to know a little bit more about you. Some of our audience have heard you live, but some have never, met you. This is the first time they're meeting you. So, where were you born, and how did you get interested in music in general?
Oh gosh, I was born in Moscow in a long time ago, in the other century. I grew up in Moscow. My dad was a poet and a literature teacher, and my mom was actually an English teacher. So I had that background of teachers in my family, which was very, very helpful, particularly because of my dad, who was just a prolific scholar of Russian literature. He knew probably entire Eugene Onegin by heart. He could recite the entire Silver Age of Russian poetry, say from the break of the 20th century, by heart. He wrote his own poetry. He could recite it, and he really instilled in me that love of Russian literature and love of Russian poetry. And I think when we talk about Russian art song, it is impossible to ignore the poetry, and I feel that that's a major reason why I love this music so much and love this repertoire so much. I came to US in 91 on the day of the coup. I actually got my visa on the very day when Soviet Union collapsed. I'm not joking about that. There were tanks on the streets. Yeah, yeah. It was really kind of a strange experience. I was 16 years old. I had to go to American embassy to get my visa, and all Americans were absolutely terrified. I think it's the only reason they gave me visa. Long story how that happened. But then later, I always loved singing, and somehow a grumpy old man. He was 95 years old when he died. He was born in 1912. His name was Semyon Lvovich Trigubov. He was this Russian teacher who lived in, of all places, Claremont, New Hampshire. He said, "You have good voice. You come to me 5 days a week. I will teach you for free." And he taught me how to sing when I was 17, 18 years old. And then I ended up going to New England Conservatory, Juilliard, and Boston University. That's where I got my doctorate. And I had a decent career performance career, but I've accepted a full-time professorship at a small university called Linfield University. Actually, we just changed our name. We used to be college, now we're university.
Oh, wow.
And I've been teaching there ever since, and I live in Oregon, on the
That
other side of the country.
and
And I'm not looking back. I used to live on the East Coast, and I'm not looking back. It's the best coast. I love it here.
we love your coast also. We enjoy coming there to visit you.
It is so beautiful.
It
And the
is.
fishing is great.
Well, that's fantastic. And so, anybody who wants to learn Russian songs in the United States, I know that they use your anthology, Russian anthology, that you put together, and transliterations as well. So you're quite famous among the singers who want to sing Russian music.
You know how we say in Russian, Milana, я широко известен в узких кругах. I'm very widely known in narrow circles. Yes, the professional singers do know my name, and the reason that is also kind of an accident. When I was at Juilliard, I worked with great coach Nico Castel, who is quite famous for writing about 15 volumes, each about this thick, of transliterations and translations of operatic librettos. And he published them through many, many years. And one day he said, Belov, you understand IPA very well. You understand phonetics. Now, I don't have anybody who can write the Russian volume of my books. You go ahead and do it. Like, okay. And so for 2 years, I've been still finishing my grad studies and writing this book. And I ended up writing, six operas originally, but then I wrote a few more translations, and after that I also did many songs and aria anthologies, and yes, I run a website called RussianArtSong.com. So yes.
That's fantastic. So that will lead us into beautifully transition into what you are talking today about. So
Sure.
go ahead.
Shall I share my screen?
Absolutely.
Okay, here we go.
Share
Share
away.
screen. Share this. Okay, everybody can see this?
Yes, if you can, is there
Yeah, I will hide it.
bars, yeah, on the side.
Where does it say? Hide. Here we go. Okay, now it looks good, yes? All right, so before we can even talk about what Russian art song is, we should probably discuss the brief history of Russia and Russian music. As you can imagine, Russia follows kind of a parallel development to the West, although it is not quite the same. One of the major reasons is the culture of the Orthodox Church, which specifically prohibits usage of instruments in worship. Specifically prohibits that whole concept of orchestral music in the church simply did not exist in the Russian church, and still is explicitly prohibited. In fact, if you follow a theological reason why, I think you will find that it goes as far back as not even Christianity, but pre-Christian Greece. You know, even in Plato's times, Plato designated vocal music as more appropriate for worship, while instrumental music were more appropriate for parties, for feasts, for military, in other words, secular entertainment rather than actual religious music. So it was prohibited, and so that affected the entire culture in many, many ways. However, Westernization in Russia begins with the reign of Tsar Peter the Great. Now, what was so great about him? Well, for one thing, he was very, very tall. He was something like 6'6", which is incredibly high height for anyone at that age. He also, of course, introduced Western customs to Russia. He went abroad. He studied naval engineering. He studied furniture making. He studied things like clock making and military. And he forced everybody to wear Western dress. I mean, you see he's shaven. If you compare it to any Tsar that you can see prior to that, of course, he has a full beard. You know, in fact, speaking of Orthodox Church, if a man were to shave prior to Peter the Great, he would be excommunicated from communion. He would not be allowed to partake of communion. There was a term for that in Slavonian called bludolubny vid, which is kind of a funny expression, means someone who likes adultery. That's that's actual text. That's actual expression. So yes, every man was supposed to look like a hipster in Russia before Peter the Great. So with him also, of course, he brings not only Western customs, but also Western music. So we can see that Tsarina Anne imports the first Italian operatic troupe as early as 1735. Yeah. However, you notice again, we're talking about Italian fashions, Italian music, not necessarily native original Russian music during the 18th century. It was all about Westernization. Yeah. Now, Dmitry Bortnyansky, a fascinating character, was Russia's first professional composer. He was the first one to make a living from composing. He traveled abroad. He lived in Vienna. In fact, he composed some Italian-style operas that sound a lot like Mozart. You will see that his birthday is very close to that of Mozart. So he wrote in that classical, pre-classical style and introduced it back to Russia. In fact, he became the first director of the Royal Chapel in St. Petersburg and composed Russian church music in the Western style. He was the first one to compose such music, very much in that German / Russian style, which became a real hybrid. He also wrote some of the first Russian art songs, but there's so few of them and they're not that interesting, so we're not going to talk about them in great detail. There he is. As you can see, he looks like he could be Mozart's relative. Okay, now, the first real opera in Russian with a Russian theme was, of course, The Life for the Tsar by Mikhail Glinka. And you can see how late it is. It's 1836, so Russia, in a sense, was quite late to this party, so to say, you know. Okay, and, of course, the first residential orchestra only comes to Russia in 1856, quite late. And conservatories are established in Moscow and St. Petersburg in 1862 and 1866 by the Rubinstein brothers, Nikolai and Anton Rubinstein. Okay, now, fun fact, my grandmother was a Rubinstein, and there's a family lore that we're somehow distantly related. I don't know if that's true. My parents told me they named me Anton after Anton Rubinstein. Again, I have no idea whether that's true. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about this genre of art song, where it comes from, what it is, and its cultural significance. Of course, it starts in a German-speaking lands, and it is called Lieder, which is a plural of Lied, and really begins in the early 18th century and continues all through the 19th century and arguably continues to this day. Lieder, of course, originates as a genre of popular entertainment. You know, it is not a genre necessarily designed for a grand operatic hall, for grand concert hall. It is a genre designed for a living room. And here, of course, one of the most famous depictions of a typical Viennese Lieder concert. Who do you think is sitting there at the piano? Anybody can recognize this little guy, kind of short, glasses, overweight? Anybody knows? You can unmute yourself.
I'm guessing Schubert.
Oh, yes, it's Schubert, of course. And this man right next to him is Vogel. Vogel was a great baritone at Vienna Opera, and he was about a foot or more taller than Schubert, and they always walked together. There's a very funny caricature of them walking together, and Schubert is this tiny little mushroom, and Vogel is like huge oak tree, walking together. And they collaborated for years, and Vogel premiered some of his most famous works, such as Winterreise. And this is really the atmosphere of a typical Liederabend, a typical evening of songs. I see ladies swooning, gentlemen standing behind listening. It reminds me of when I was very young. I was, 15, 16 years old in Moscow and St. Petersburg, going to these house concerts with a bunch of hippies. We'll gather around with guitars and maybe conga drum or two and perform in these house quasi-underground concerts. That is a similar atmosphere, and that's partly why I love the genre so much, because it's so intimate. It's so much about poetry. It's so much about personal expression, yeah? All right, so German is Lieder, French is Mélodie. By the way, Mélodie is quite late to the party. If you compare our standard repertoire, where we get most of our repertoire in German, I would say the bulk of our performing repertoire is Schubert. It's early 19th century. While Mélodie, really sophisticated French art song, doesn't really come to fruition until late 19th century, until Fauré, until Debussy, and later Poulenc. The 19th century, those songs are they're imitations in compared to sophisticated German Lieder. It wasn't really their genre. In Italian, of course, it's canzone or aria, romanza. All these terms designate something similar. I mean, canzone usually means a more popular song. And aria, well, in Italian, all songs are really called arias, more sophisticated arias. And romanza is closer to Lieder. It's close to the intimate, often sentimental songs that are often epistolary in quality, meaning they are like letters, like love letters that presume an addressee. It's the most common form of a romance. Now, Russian, here we come, Russian has a particular term for what we do with art song. We call it a romance. Now, romance, of course, is that romantic term that is present in Italian, in French, in Spanish. And as I said before, the idea of a romance is a lyric art song, meaning from point of view, from personal point of view, to my beloved, expressing something, usually longing, expressing a desire. And we have examples like these throughout all the national styles that wrote love songs. I mean, come on, Sinatra. Those are romances. Frank Sinatra really is coming from the same tradition. Jazz very much comes from the same tradition, at least that standard American jazz. Okay, so before we can go any further, we need to discuss a little bit of the 19th century and the early 19th century, the cultural movements that are so important in the production of the romance, production of this genre. So what do we know about the early 19th century? It is the age of Napoleon. It's the age of Napoleon, who invades Russia in 1812 and who is soundly defeated by Russia's greatest general. Do you know who Russia's greatest general was? General Winter. General Winter, as you know, they occupied Moscow. Moscow burned to the ground, and they were forced to eat crows and dogs and cats. And at the end, Napoleonic army that numbered something like 600,000 soldiers was forced to leave Russia at only 100,000 soldiers. So it was a pretty sound defeat. Russians, by the way, chased Napoleon all the way back to Paris. And fun fact, in 1813, they marched through northern Italy and ransacked a town of Busseto. And supposedly there was a horrible massacre, and the only child that survived that massacre was one called Giuseppe Verdi. Just a little fun fact, he was 1 year old at that time. His mother hid him in the bell tower. Okay, it's also the age of Beethoven, yes? In fact, when we think of early Romanticism, it is completely dominated by Beethoven, who dies in 1827. It's also the age of bel canto. Now, what is bel canto? It is something that is really quite hard to express, but very easy to recognize. It's the style of Italian opera of the early 19th century. We think of bel canto as, of course, represented by the three greats in Italy, that is Rossini, Bellini, and Donizetti. But that style, of course, spreads throughout Europe. French opera of the early 19th century cannot be imagined without bel canto. So is Russian opera. Glinka's works are entirely in the bel canto tradition. Think of it as music that is designed to express and to showcase the natural beauty of the human voice. We singers always prize ourselves at being bel canto singers. It is a very special thing. It's a very special set of aesthetics of how to sing in the most elegant and also ergonomically correct fashion. The singing tradition, the pedagogical tradition that we still teach really comes from the bel canto tradition. Okay, it's also the age of Schubert. We talked about what Schubert's contributions are to the genre of art song, of course. He composed 600 art songs. That's a lot. He composed one a day, at least. It's also what is called in the West the age of Biedermeier, or the age prior to May. That's what it means. Biedermeier, before May. Now, why May? It's because of the May uprisings of 1848. So that period from the Congress of Vienna of 1815 to 1848 in many ways is thought of as the rise of middle class, particular type of art and even furniture that glorified that domesticity, that middle class, kind of conservative family values. That's Biedermeier. And also, of course, we already said that Lieder is a chamber genre, a genre associated not necessarily with the upper classes, but with the middle class. And it's in Russia, of course, the age of Pushkin. You cannot imagine having a great national art song tradition without a great poetic tradition. And of course, Pushkin is our greatest poet by far. Fascinating character. There he is. As you can see, he lived only to the age of 37. His life by itself is like a romantic story by itself. You know, he has an incredible family background. He was part African. His great-grandfather was an Ethiopian slave. Well, actually, he was not a slave. He was born a prince, but then kidnapped by the Ottomans and later given as a gift to Tsar Peter the Great. And Peter loved him so much, became his godfather, sent him to Paris to study military engineering. He came back, he received the noble rank, married a Russian woman, actually two women, one after another, and that's Pushkin's heritage on one side, and on the other, he can count his heritage for many, many generations into time and memoriam of great, Viking kings of Russia. So Pushkin has an incredible background, and he's the founder of Russian love poetry. He is the founder of what we think of Russian literature, period. And of course, it's the age of Romanticism. I should probably mention what Romanticism is, because without Romanticism, art song in Europe or art song in Russian is absolutely unimaginable. Okay, well, before I get to Romanticism, let me talk about romance as a genre. So what is this term? It is a word, of course, borrowed from French and is a Western import. It comes to Russia in the late 1700s, and it becomes very much adapted to Russian's own characteristics. So what are the influences of romance? Italian opera, for sure. So much of early romance sounds like a little aria taken from Bellini or Donizetti, for sure. French chanson, also very much an influence. Spanish song, German lieder to a degree. There are some songs that sound absolutely like Schubert. You put them side by side, you say it's definitely Schubert, you know. But of course, also Russian own characteristics, Russian folk songs, Russian harmony. You know, most of Russian songs happen to be in a minor key. Well, that also sips into Russian romance or Russian art song for sure. And of course, influences from exotic, quote unquote, non-Western peoples such as Roma and the Jewish music. Very, very interesting background. It's its own original genre, and it's a very, very rich tradition. So perhaps before we can talk about sophisticated romance or the art songs written by professional composers, we should mention a typical Russian guitar romance. It is a genre that is strongly influenced by the Roma, strongly influenced by everyday composers. I have a whole album, whole collection of these romances written by amateurs, written by counts and countesses and officers and middle-class amateurs and not professional composers whatsoever. And this music still remains some of the most popular music in the repertoire. I'll give you an example. This song was written, the one I'm about to play, by Count Boris Sheremetyev from 1822 to 1906. He comes from one of the wealthiest families in Russia, or maybe ever. They are Russian Rockefellers. When I was growing up in Moscow, I grew up in a high-rise and ninth-story, typical Soviet building. But across the road from me, there was a famous estate of Kuskovo, and it looked like this. What do you think, folks? Humble little suburb. That place was owned and built by Count Sheremetyev, the ancestor of the composer Sheremetyev. And Sheremetyev today is remembered for one famous and simple song called I Was in Love with You. The text is by Pushkin that he wrote for this young lady. She was 16 years old. Her name was Olenina. And he proposed to marry her, and she said no. Wise idea, by the way. Pushkin was probably not the best husband ever. And when he came back to her, he basically replied to her rejection by writing this beautiful poem, and the poem is absolutely gorgeous. It's one of the most set poems in Russian repertoire. It says, I was in love with you. It still is kindled in my heart a little bit, but I don't want you to think about it at all. I was in love with you so tenderly, so gently, as I wish you to be loved by another. Absolutely beautiful short poem. And here is an incredible performance by Valery Agafonov, not an actual trained singer, but actually an actor who made his name by recording pretty much underground recordings, home recordings in 1970s and early 80s of these incredible romances performed on the famous Russian 7-string guitar.
Угасла печалить вас ничем. Я вас любил безмолвно, безнадежно, то робостью, то нежностью томим. Я вас любил так искренне, так нежно, когда я вам Бог, любимой быть другим. Когда я вам Бог,
This is a fascinating story, by the way, about Valery Agafonov. He died very young. He was 42 years old, I believe, had a heart attack and died. Tremendous performer. If you have a chance, I can send you a description. I can put it in program notes or something. There's a Spotify. I think Spotify released most of his underground recordings because most of these are home recordings. They're not professionally done at all. And it is absolutely marvelous singing. Absolutely marvelous. In fact, little side note, my friend Oleg Timofeyev, who's a virtuoso 7-string guitar performer, and I are working on an album of Russian art songs with a guitar accompaniment, and they are absolutely beautiful. I posted on SoundCloud about a dozen of them, and if you're interested, I will send you a link afterwards. It is a marvelous repertoire, absolutely beautiful stuff. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what Romanticism and Romantic period is. It's a kind of a confusing term because to define it is not that easy, and the time period is very confusing. When you talk to a literature historian, we talk about Romantic century from 1750 to 1850, while music history usually talks about Romantic period from the death of Beethoven in 1827 and the early 20th century, 1900 in other words. So it's confusing. It is best to think of the 19th century or the long 19th century as being strongly influenced by the ideas of Romanticism. Now, what are those ideas? First of all, of course, individualism. It's this philosophical idea and I would say psychological idea of individual as the most important element of human society. Yeah, emotionalism as kind of an extension of the same idea, expression of personal emotion. I desire for things that I'll put in big air quotes, naturalism, natural things. Hence, of course, this famous painting of David Caspar Friedrich of a wanderer in the fog, looking out in the distance and finding certain inspiration and discovery through nature in its most wild state possible, not to conquer it, but to observe it and admire it for what it is. Yeah, the striving for everything authentic, interest in things exotic, foreign cultures, foreign musical ideas as well, desire for things medieval, religiosity in this very mystical way, and desire for folklore, which also grows into a darker side of Romanticism, and that is nationalism. Political Romanticism in Europe is associated with nationalism, with unification of Germany, with the rise of France, with rise of national nation states, such as Italy, quote-unquote unification of Italy in 1860s. Again, that's a term that not everybody agrees with. Some people still don't really like that whole concept of Italy as a unifying state and still think of themselves as being from a particular region. And again, that's a relatively young country, Italy is. Okay, so what is Romanticism in music? I will go through this very quickly. Highly individualized styles. If you listen to, say, Mozart and Salieri and, say, J.C. Bach, not J.S. Bach, but Bach's son, Johann Christian Bach, early examples of that, you will not be able to distinguish between those composers. They basically composed in the same styles, the same style. However, if you listen to 3 notes of Beethoven, you know it's Beethoven. Yeah. If you listen to one phrase by Berlioz, you know that's Berlioz. The styles that are very, very different, very specific, very particular. Representation of heightened emotional states. Things such as macabre and dark things are important during this period. Think of such works as Symphonie Fantastique of Berlioz or Erlkönig of Franz Schubert. Programmatic music. Now, programmatic music, of course, is music that tells an extra musical ideas. Tone poems of Liszt are grand examples of that, or Rimsky-Korsakov writing orchestral works such as Scheherazade. In other words, orchestral or instrumental works that have program behind them, that are theatrical in nature. Yeah? And musical nationalism, which is very important for us here, because musical nationalism is an attempt at creating styles that are uniquely distinct from pan-European style of composition. In other words, an attempt. How would you do it? How would you express nationalism in music? Well, probably the easiest way is to utilize folk songs. And hence you definitely hear composers such as Mussorgsky using folk songs in operas. You know, there's a moment, for example, in Rimsky-Korsakov Tsar's Bride, when a character sings an a cappella Russian folk song. You know, that's very, very unusual for the period and very much a hallmark of nationalism in music. And exoticism, of course, is an attempt of utilizing harmonies from completely distant lands or different cultures. In Russian music, that would be an attempt of utilizing so-called Persian scale, a scale that makes it sound very Middle Eastern. I'll play a little bit on the piano, but I think it's maybe you won't be able to hear it. When you hear something like that in Russian music, it immediately brings you to Middle East, you know, to Islamic or Jewish cultures. Okay. All right. So a couple of things about Russian nationalism. In 1825, a particular event occurred in Russia that shaped the history of the entire 19th century, and that is the Decembrist rebellion that occurred in December of 1825, an attempt by idealistic Russian aristocracy to overthrow the Tsar and establish a constitutional monarchy in kind of a British model. That failed drastically, and the series of reforms instituted particularly by Sergei Uvarov, Tsar's Minister of Education, established postulates of Russian education, Russian nationalism, and that is what? Pravoslavia, the orthodoxy, Samodержавие, autocracy, and Narodnost, which is love of everything folksy. You know, that's what Narodnost is, it's nationalism. And it is an answer to the French ideals that are what? Liberté, égalité, and fraternité. The liberty, equality, and fraternity. Russians viewed their point of view as being superior to dangerous Republican democratic view of the French. Hence, a very conservative century in Russia, very conservative. So let's talk about the composers of this period. The first truly Russian composer that established very much a Russian national style was Mikhail Ivanovich Glinka. He spent his youth in St. Petersburg, studied with John Field. You know who that is? He was an Irish composer and pianist who established a nocturne style even before Chopin. And he lived for many years in Russia and taught several important Russian musicians and composers, including Glinka and Gurilov and several others. He traveled extensively throughout Europe and traveled through Italy, France, Germany, Spain, studied with German theoretician Dane. Now, Dane also taught people such as Mendelssohn and others, also very important. He knew many of the Western composers, such as Bellini, Mendelssohn, Berlioz. So, why is he important? Well, he wrote two very important operas. Number one is The Life of the Tsar, and the other one is Ruslan and Lyudmila. Both of them utilize Russian nationalist subjects. Yet, if you listen to that music, you will see that it is mostly in the predominant style of bel canto. Bel canto, they're very Italianate in their style. And you can hear the same thing in his art songs. They are absolutely gorgeous, but they sound Italian. I would like to play for you, maybe not the whole song because it's rather long, but just a couple of minutes of this gorgeous song. It's called I Recall a Beautiful Moment. And there's a beautiful story behind it. You see, Glinka was dating a young lady by the name of Kern. Her last name was Kern, or Kern, sorry, not Kern, Kern. Her name, she was a daughter of Anna Kern. Anna Kern was lover of Alexander Pushkin. Alexander Pushkin wrote a beautiful poem for her that he presented to her as a gift. I recall a beautiful moment. You appeared to me as an apparition, as a genius of pure beauty. And he describes his exile for many years and his separation from her, and then seeing her again after many years, and how his heart is again beating with such excitement. Well, that's the funny thing, because the song is written for her daughter by the composer who was dating her. So this song is addressed to two Kerns, to two women, the same last name. So let's listen a little bit of this beautiful bel canto romance in the performance of great Russian tenor Sergei Lemeshev. You can hear this okay, yes?
Я помню чудное мгновение, передо мной явилась ты, как мимолетное видение, как гений чистой красоты, как гений чистой красоты. В томлении грусти безнадежной, в тревогах шумной суеты звучал мне долго голос нежный, и снились милые черты, и снились милые черты. Шли годы, бурь порыв.
To stop here because I'm running out of time and I don't want to go too long. But as you can hear, this melody, this beautiful overarching melody over very simple pianistic accompaniment is very much a hallmark of the bel canto style. All right, so next we need to move to the group of young composers who were active beginning in 1850s and through the 60s and 70s in St. Petersburg, and that's the Mighty Five. Now, the term Mighty Five is actually not quite correct. The original term comes from a newspaper article by a Russian critic, Serov, who described them as the mighty handful, a mighty little bunch of people, gathered together, united by similar artistic ideas. Now, their ideals were establishing their own independent nationalist Russian tradition. The leader and perhaps the most well-educated of them all was Mily Alexandrovich Balakirev. He was a fantastic pianist, very much self-taught, but of a very high level. Famously, he performed as a soloist Beethoven's Emperor Concerto in front of Tsar Alexander the First. Wait, first or second? Yes, Alexander the Second. Sorry. Gosh, I don't know. I'm mixing up my tsars. The rest of them were amateurs. Borodin was a chemist. Who, on his gravestone, had said, "I'm a chemist, and I've established a medical school in Russia." It says nothing about him being a composer. QE was a military engineer. Mussorgsky was a officer of Preobrazhensky Regiment. And Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov was a naval officer. In fact, he circumnavigated the earth at one point and was in New York City during the Civil War in 1862, I believe, 61 or 62, something like this. So all these composers, they are composing mostly by instinct, not from great musical theory. And, there's a problem with that. One is that they're all self-taught. And you do need to know theory. You do need to know the history of music to really be able to be a legitimate composer. Yet they were able to create this highly unusual and very specific, ethno-specific style that really established Russian music as its own animal. Curiously, there's a little anecdote about Rimsky-Korsakov. In the 1870s, he was offered a position of a professor at St. Petersburg Conservatory. Well, he wrote in his diary that he has never in his life harmonized the chorale. In other words, he had no idea how to teach music theory. And he had to actually go like theory one, study how to write in the style of Bach, our typical theoretical exercises. So just tells you that these guys were completely self-taught. So the most unusual of them all, of course, was Modest Mussorgsky. Now, it's a tragic story. We don't really know the reasons, the sources of his malady. Most likely he was bipolar. Most likely he had some sort of a mental illness. You can see on the left of your screen his portrait as a young man, an officer, young handsome officer of Preobrazhensky regiment, the most elite Tsar's Guard regiment in entire St. Petersburg. And you can see a tragic portrait of him written only few days before his death, unfortunately, at a mental institution. He was definitely bipolar, and he self-medicated with alcohol and died of alcohol poisoning, unfortunately. His works, some of his works, are absolutely strokes of genius. I mean, the great opera, Boris Godunov or Khavanshina and Sarachinsky Fair, most of them were unfinished. Most of his works were left unfinished, and his friends, particularly Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, had to complete them and edit them to prepare them for publication. Well, the problem is Rimsky-Korsakov edited a lot of weird stuff out. Mussorgsky would write things like chords without thirds in them, or chords based on the fourths and the fifths. Well, today we think of those chords as being the very foundations of modernist harmony. But at that time, people just thought he was weird. So he was way ahead of his time, but later composers absolutely adored his writing because it was so daring and unusual for the time period. Now, Mussorgsky wrote in a style that we should think of as realism. Yeah, realism is a rebellion against Romanticism. Romanticism is all about escaping the everyday, going into the dream state, going into the distant realities, into non-existent medieval world or foreign cultures, looking for that, inner something, going deep inside oneself. And realism was all about looking at life the way it is. Materialist, often very dark, present. Realism focused on the life of the middle classes, not middle classes, of the lower classes. In Italy, you can think of realism as the Verismo style, works such as Pagliacci or La Bohème, Il Tabarro of Puccini. That's Verismo. In Russian, it's, of course, the songs of Mussorgsky. I would love to play for you a little excerpt from his unfinished song cycle called The Songs and Dances of Death. Absolutely terrifying song cycle. Death appears as a character. A personalization. Now, if I were to ask an American, if you think of death as a character, do you think of it as being a male character or female character? No, in German it's der Tod. Yeah, it's German. It's male. Usually in English it's the Ripper. Grim Reaper, also male character. But in French or Italian, in all Romance languages, la morte, yes, la morte is feminine. In Russian, smert is feminine. It's usually female representation. But throughout these songs, death as a character changes its character. It changes its appearance. In the first song, death appears as a babysitter, really scary, very, very scary. It's called the Lullaby. In the second song, death appears as a medieval knight who comes and seduces a maiden. And the third song, death is a village witch that seduces a drunk peasant who walks through the road at night, and she lures him into the snow and then freezes him to death. Absolutely horror movie stuff. Very macabre. And the final song, death appears as a general who rides on a field of battle and declares to everyone, hey, you used to be fighting, life made you enemies, I made you friends, you're now all my soldiers. Absolutely incredible poetry, by the way. Okay, here's a little bit of Songs and Dances of Death. And you can hear, this is an orchestration by Shostakovich, by the way. And you can hear a little bit of a Russian dance in it. It's called trepak. Trepak is a dance in duple meter. It sounds like tam patatam 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 pam pam. And you can hear that Death is dancing this dance with this old peasant.
Yes, the yes,
Here's the dance.
Слишком согрею, круг тебя
realize that if I go on, I just will have absolutely no time left. And you can imagine I'm only about one half through. So let me move on. Now, a huge change occurs in Russia in 1860s, and that is the establishment of conservatories. Now, as I told you before, all the other composers prior to 1862 were all self-taught, including the Rubinstein brothers, by the way. Anton Rubinstein, particularly, was an excellent composer in the Western vein, very much in the Western vein. He traveled throughout Europe at the age of 9. And in fact, while in Europe, while I believe in Amsterdam, he met one of the Russian tsarinas who kind of adopted him and became his patron and donated a lot of money for the establishment of formal musical education in Russia, hence the establishment of St. Petersburg Conservatory in 1862 and later Moscow Conservatory in 1866. The very first class was, of course, none other than Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky, perhaps one of the most famous composers in the world. Now, you Americans know Tchaikovsky for two pieces: the Nutcracker and the 1812 Overture. Both of those pieces were not Tchaikovsky's favorite. Were not at all Tchaikovsky's favorite. We Russians think of him as the composer of Eugene Onegin and composer of the Pique Dame, of many symphonies, and hundreds of art songs, absolutely hundreds of art songs. Now, his art songs are absolutely glorious, and by now they utilize piano in a very different way than the earlier Russian compositions. It's no longer just a basic accompaniment in the background. No, the piano is very much a full, a equal member of the performing team. I will play you just a little bit of some of his most beautiful and gorgeous lyric romances. It's a wonderful Armenian mezzo-soprano, Zara Dorohan.
Печали друг
just wonderful, but we don't have time, of course. So I will just quickly go on and talk quickly about Tchaikovsky. Kind of a tragic life. Tchaikovsky stop it. Sorry, my technical issues. Tchaikovsky, of course, as you probably know, had a very tragic life. He's particularly because of his sexuality. He was homosexual and spent much of his life escaping a mistake that he made. He married a woman, which was not a good idea for him. His marriage lasted about 2 weeks. He had a nervous breakdown, and he spent much of his time traveling throughout Europe. Much of his works are written in Italy, for example. Great Eugene Onegin was written in San Romeo, I believe, yes? Sanremo. It's written in Sanremo. Nevertheless, he achieved great fame and great prestige. In Russia, he was given the Order of St. Vladimir, which is like receiving a presidential medal of freedom or something like that. He is one of the greats by far. Now, St. Petersburg Conservatory particularly produced a whole slew of composers that we think of as being more minor composers, but yet they wrote incredible songs. Anton Arensky is one of them. Sergei Taneyev is another. Again, I'm completely out of time, so I don't really have time talking about them, but their repertoire is some of my absolute favorite. And finally, the late 19th century, early 20th century. And that is what I call the immigrant generation. Most of these great composers ended up in the West. Amongst them is Alexander Glazunov, Sergei Rachmaninoff, Nikolai Medtner. Glazunov actually served as a dean of the conservatory for a while, yet left Russia in 1927, never returned. Rachmaninoff was from a wealthy background, but his beloved estate was ransacked by the communists, so he had to flee Russia, settled first in Paris, in Switzerland, and eventually in the United States. He passed away in I think he died in Hollywood. He died in California. And finally, Nikolai Medtner, whom not that many people know, and that's too bad because he is one of the great composer pianists in the Lisztian vein. And his songs kind of sound like Rachmaninoff on steroids. They're just absolutely giant in their field. Now, have you seen that kind of a not really accurate movie, Shine? Which talks about was he an Australian pianist, I believe, on the spectrum, not an artistic spectrum. And there's a scene where they have a clay replica of Rachmaninoff's hands, and they're like this long. His fingers were enormous. He could play these incredible chords just because his fingers were so incredible. And he wrote his piano works in a similar fashion. And just to demonstrate a little bit of Rachmaninoff's style, I would like to play you a little bit of Rachmaninoff's one of the most virtuosic songs called Arion, text by Pushkin, in the performance of Nikolai Gedda. And I realize I'm completely out of time, so I'll just escape from this and see if you have any questions.
Anton, thank you. This is incredible. You inspired me to go and practice.
Thank you.
Thank you. No, it's been a while actually since I was inspired to go and practice. So thank you. I very much appreciate it. Yes, we are out of time, but I do, if you have time and if our
Oh, I have time. I
question,
have nothing to do right now. I have plenty of time.
right, you're withering the pandemic, right? David, do you have a question?
I do, of course I have. It's a little, maybe a little far-fetched. It's been said, or I heard at one time, that Pushkin's poetry was untranslatable out of Russian to get the proper meaning. So my question would be, if that were true, why wouldn't it not be true that the music would be the same? For example, a Russian hearing Borodin would hear it differently than a Westerner hearing Borodin.
Well, because music is a universal language, I know it's a cliche. But yes, it's true that music exists in its own political, cultural context. And yes, music affects us in a different way and it sounds differently. And certain things become quite dated, in fact, particularly political things. It's always a question of context, yeah? It's a question of context. It's a question of how we perceive certain things. I'll give you an example. I direct an opera festival here, and I always have a problem picking opera pieces that are relevant to today, yeah, that are not too embarrassing. For example, the magic flute. If you take it for what it is and you actually take those lines about women, they are so sexist, they're so male chauvinist that they are absolutely inappropriate for today's audiences. Just horrible, absolutely. If I were to say something like this at my job, I will be fired. I will be canceled. I will be canceled, yes? The same thing about certain national elements. For example, Mussorgsky's Boris Godunov really vilifies the Polish. It sounded great in the 19th century. Right now, it's a little bit problematic after 150 years. And yes, we do perceive certain messages in that music differently. However, if you're talking about just purely hearing certain music and feeling something about it because certain evocation of nationalist elements in it. Well, talking about Borodin is a perfect example because a couple of guys on Broadway adopted Borodin and made it into Kismet. You all know that. Imagine these. You know where that comes from? Yeah, it's a nocturne from his second violin quartet, yes? Or take my hand, I'm a stranger in paradise, all lost in the wonderland, a stranger in paradise. And ironically, this is not supposed to be Russian anyway. He is trying to depict an exotic culture, so there's nothing particularly Russian there.
Now I'm really confused, but thank you very much. It was terrific.
No. Why? I'm happy to explain it. You know that song, yeah? Take my hand, I'm a stranger in paradise, all lost in a wonderland, a stranger in paradise. Tony Bennett used to sing this. It's from Kismet.
Very, very popular song.
Yeah,
and it's sort of in the context of I can hear, for example, if I hear music that is Eastern European or Middle Eastern, I can tell that it is that sound because that sound is produced from that culture. But my question is whether I hear it in the same way as a native would hear it. Now, I can recognize a folk song, a country folk song, in listening to whatever. Do I hear it there? It's the context.
I think we are. I think we are delving into musical psychological question. We are delving into musical psychological questions. So, all right. There's a research that says that the music that we listen to as teenagers is going to be our favorite music forever. For example, I was growing up as a teenager. I discovered the Beatles, and I discovered Led Zeppelin, King Crimson, Pink Floyd, and also a bunch of Russian rock bands. And let me be honest, I still absolutely love that music, though I went to Juilliard and I went to Boston University and my background is exclusively classical. I still absolutely love that rock. Now, why? Because when I was maturing, that's the music that I heard and that's the music that I love. So I would assume that when we talk about the native hearing the music of their own culture, it triggers something in us immediately that we recognize from childhood, that we recognize from long time ago, and that particular melody will always evoke a certain reaction. I have no doubt that that would be an example. And I think that's the same principle that is used in music therapy, that is used in music psychology, that certain melodies are inevitably associated with certain...
If you remember, I made the reference to the fact that you can't nobody can understand Pushkin unless you read it in Russian. It was sort of in that context that I'm kind of approaching the music. But that may or may not be true. You would know a lot better than I did, since I haven't read in Russian.
I don't quite subscribe to that concept of Pushkin not being understood in English. Yes, you cannot quite hear the flow of the language. Yeah, sure. But the meaning, you can deliver the meaning. It's fine, but it's that rhythm. It's that rhythm of poetry that is very hard to translate.
And that relates to music, of course. That same way.
Yeah, and the same thing is true for any culture. You know. And again, there's a question of pan-European tradition versus nationalist tradition. Yeah, and I would argue that at its base, Russian music is still very European. It has that, Russian flavor sprinkled about it. But if you take an orchestral work of, say, Tchaikovsky, Rachmaninoff, and you have to describe why is it Russian? Really? Like, okay, compare this to a German work. Yeah, of course there will be some difference, but I think it's overrated, that kind of differences, especially in non-vocal works.
Well, thank you. This was a terrific program. I loved it.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else has any questions? Feel free to unmute yourself and then Michael, yes, go ahead. And you have to unmute yourself, Michael. Wait before you speak. Unmute yourself.
I feel better now. I've no questions or answers other than the fact that it was the most marvelous 1 hour plus. It was so enlightening. I got notes a mile long, and I could do with having you here to give us another talk. I hope we'll hear more of you. Great.
And by the way, Michael is tuning in from Leeds, England, so it's he's
thank you so much.
Terrific.
You are in England. You have to. I skipped him, but you have to study Mettner.
Yes, I've got that down here because I don't know anything about him, but I
Nikolai Mettner spent his last years in England.
Really? Well,
yes.
I'm going to listen to him shortly. But
there is a website called mettner.org.uk that is dedicated specifically to Mettner.
What you said about your favorite music when you were youthful and teenage and before, I totally agree, because we've all been involved in classical music. But if I tell you that my half of life is the American Songbook, and it was when I was young, and it never goes away. And this is what we do.
Absolutely. What is that for you?
Say that again.
What music is that for you?
The American Songbook. Well, everything that Cole Porter, Gershwin, and all that stuff. That as if you speak to our colleagues in Florida, you'll know what I'm talking about because I'm a jazz piano player.
Wonderful. I'm so into jazz now, I cannot even tell you. I've been in quarantine. I discovered my love of jazz and Sinatra and all the Rat Pack. I've been singing live karaoke concerts every day at Facebook groups because I love it so much.
Well, if you think about the romanticism of the 40s and the words and the songs that are so melodic, nothing like today, and the great feeling that and the emotion that comes from the songs and the words, it's really a great event in our lives that we've been exposed to this. So if you want to sing over the WhatsApp and stuff like that, give me a ring.
Yes.
I can tell you, I can play probably every American Songbook song.
That's wonderful. Let's do that.
I'll connect
All right, Milana.
You can do the video concert.
Oh, I will totally do it. I will totally do it because I've been doing these almost every day. It's so much fun. I just feel that it's the way to keep my voice in shape.
Right. Okay.
And not classical music. I've been singing a lot.
Send me an email with your favorite songs.
Absolutely.
I'll connect.
All of me. Why not take all of me?
Absolutely.
Can't you see I'm a mess without you?
Oh.
Sally, did you have a question?
No,
Yes!
It was so interesting and so informative.
Okay, enough.
Sorry, Michael. Sally, tell again, you were saying, Sally.
I said it was so interesting and so informative. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in. And Galet for tuning in from New York. David Fu, thanks for tuning in from upstate New York.
Can I say something?
Yes, absolutely. Go ahead.
My first language was Russian. I was born in Palestine. And I remember as a child having a patyphone. Is that a Russian phonograph? Patyphone? Anyway, it must be Hebrew. So we had a couple of records that were Russian. It must have been 20 years old. This was in the 1940s. And I learned all the songs and knew all the words. And I forgot them all. But I really enjoyed it. And I must tell you, the things you had us listen, the voices you had us listen from other people singing were not comparable to your voice. I wish you'd have sung us something else.
I agree.
Anton, next time you'll have to record all the songs as samples.
Next time, look, you record me the accompaniment and I will sing over it. I'll do a karaoke track. We should do the split screen, we should do a split screen. Totally doable.
It's a deal.
Totally doable.
Anyone else has any comments or questions? No? Well, thank you, Anton. This was absolutely fascinating. I'm so grateful. You woke up early in the morning to join us. And the day is just starting for you. Your Pokemon cup is right there with you. And all of you guys who are tuning in regularly for our talks, next week we will have a fantastic masterclass with Fabio Bedini, who is the head of the piano department from Colburn School. And we will have 4 long scholars who will participate. And so you can witness the masterclass in action with some of the top young people and participate in that. So I hope you will tune in for that and sign up for that as well. And it's always a great pleasure to see all of you. Anton, thank you. I will share some of your recordings online as well with our audience so that they can go and listen, especially to the latest recordings that you're doing with your friend, with a guitarist. So.
Oh yeah, do you have that? Do you have the link?
Well, You'll send it to me, and I will forward it.
Okay, I will send it. I will send you the link.
Thank you.
And I'm serious. If you want to do like a old-fashioned jazz concert, I'll totally do it. I will totally do it.
Michael, you have a partner when you come back to Florida.
Yes.
We will fly
Absolutely.
him from West Coast.
Absolutely. Send me all your favorite songs.
Oh, if you like, okay, hold on a second. I have to show you something.
We're not
I
done.
just got in the mail. My very own real book. I have my very own real book. You know what real book is, yeah?
I have dozens.
Yes.
I give them away.
What's that?
Oh, yes, 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 yes.
So
In fact, we're actually throwing a lot of our music out because I don't look at it anymore. It's all there,
Oh, that's marvelous. Marvelous.
any key.
And I'm just new to this stuff. I'm just learning.
Oh, yeah, yes. Brilliant to mix it because a lot of the classical singers have also done some of the American songbook. Kiri, and I don't know any male singers yet, but I do now.
awesome.
Brilliant.
Fantastic.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day and have a fantastic week. And I will look forward to seeing you next week. All right.
Bye,
Thank
friends.
Terrific. Bravo, bravo, everybody. Great. Milana, you're a genius. Love you.
you. Much love. Take care.